In 1867, a cattle drive crossed the Red River heading north into Kansas. 22 men, experienced, capable, hardened by weeks on the trail. At least 8 of them were black. Their names were not recorded. The trail boss's name was. That single fact tells you almost everything about how this history was going to be written. Welcome to Mystery Wild West. And what you're about to hear is the version that was buried for over 100 years. If this is the kind of history that actually restores what was taken out, subscribe. Most people have never heard what we're about to get into, and before we go any further, did anyone in your school ever teach you that 1 in 4 cowboys in the American West was black? Tell us in the comments. Because if nobody told you, you need to understand why. That omission was not an accident. Now, the myth is simple and total. The cowboy of the American West was white. He is on every poster, every movie screen, every dime novel cover, every childhood memory of what the West looked like. The hat, the horse, the dust, the open range, all of it encoded in the popular imagination as the exclusive domain of white men. That image was so completely constructed and so aggressively maintained that most Americans alive today, including many with deep family connections to the actual history, have no idea how wrong it is. Here is the number. Historians who have studied the cattle drive era estimate that between 25 and 30% of all working cowboys in the post-Civil War American West were black. 1 in 4, maybe more. On some drives, the proportion was higher. On some ranches in Texas, the majority of the working hands were black men. This was not unusual. It was not remarkable at the time. It was simply the labor reality of the cattle industry in the years immediately following the Civil War. The industry has been whitewashed so completely that the reality feels startling now. It shouldn't feel startling. It should feel like basic history. The fact that it feels startling is itself the story. So how did this happen? Where did these men come from? And why does almost no one know about them? The answer starts in Texas. In slavery? Before the Civil War, enslaved people in Texas worked cattle. This is a fact that almost never appears in the popular history of the cowboy, and it is the foundation of everything that follows. The skills that defined the working cowboy: riding, roping, reading cattle, managing a herd over long distances, understanding the land and the weather and the animals. These skills were developed and refined on Texas ranches by enslaved black men who were doing the work long before the romantic era of the cattle drive began. A man on a Texas ranch in 1855 knows cattle. He has known cattle since he was old enough to work. He knows how a herd moves when it is calm and how it moves when something is wrong. He knows the specific way a steer will shift its weight before it tries to run. He knows how to read the sky in the afternoon and what it means for where the herd needs to be by nightfall. He has this knowledge because he has been acquiring it his entire life under compulsion with no ownership of either the knowledge or himself. That knowledge did not disappear when the war ended. When the Civil War concluded and 4 million people were freed from slavery, those who had worked cattle in Texas had something that the cattle industry desperately needed: skill. Real, deep, practical skill at exactly the moment when the cattle industry was about to explode into the defining economic engine of the American West. The great cattle drives were beginning. The railheads in Kansas were opening. The demand for Texas beef in northern and eastern markets was enormous, and the men who knew how to move cattle across open country were, in significant numbers, the men who had just been freed. The industry hired them, not out of generosity, not out of any commitment to their dignity or equality, out of need. The work needed doing, and these men could do it. A cattle operation in South Texas in 1866 is putting together a drive to Abilene. They need experienced hands. The trail boss knows exactly who has the skills. He hires the men who can do the work and does not spend much time on anything else. The crew assembles. It is mixed. It will stay mixed for the duration of the drive, because out on the trail, 1,000 miles from any town, what matters is whether a man can ride and whether he can be counted on. Those were the only two questions that mattered. But here is the problem. The trail was not the world. The trail was a temporary suspension of the world. And when the drive ended and the men rode into a Kansas cattle town to collect their pay, the world reasserted itself with full force. Think about what that meant in practical terms. A black cowboy who had just completed a 3-month drive, who had ridden through storms and river crossings and stampedes, who had kept his position in the saddle and done his job as well as any man on the crew, arrived in Abilene or Dodge City or Wichita and encountered a social and legal reality that had nothing to do with competence. The saloons had policies. The hotels had policies. The entire social infrastructure of the cattle towns was organized around race in ways that the open range was not. A man who had been a working cowboy for 90 days was now in town something different, something lesser. In the eyes of the law and the custom of the place, a cowboy walks into a saloon in Abilene in 1869. He has 3 months of wages in his pocket and 3 months of thirst behind him. The bartender looks at him. The bartender looks at the other men at the bar. The bartender says something. The cowboy has heard some version of this before. He takes his wages and finds a different place, or makes do without, because making a scene will not end well for him, and he knows it. He does his drinking elsewhere, quietly, without incident. He is back on the trail in a week. The trail towns are celebrated in the mythology of the Wild West as the sites of freedom and release, the places where cowboys blew off steam after months of hard work. For black cowboys, those towns were something more complicated. The freedom was conditional. The release was partial. The celebration was for other people. And this creates the first of the great contradictions at the heart of this history. The same industry that depended on black labor to function was embedded in a society that systematically denied the humanity of that labor. The cattle drives could not have operated at the scale they did without black cowboys. The cattle town economies could not have thrived without the money those drives brought in. The entire system was built on work that included black men as essential participants, and then built a public story about the West that erased those participants almost entirely. That erasure did not happen by accident. It happened through a series of specific choices made by specific people over several decades. But before we get to how the story was erased, let us understand more fully what was being erased, because the contributions were not just numerical. They were not just 1 in 4 bodies on a drive. They were specific, skilled, irreplaceable contributions that shaped the cattle industry in ways that went far beyond showing up and doing what was asked. The most skilled position on a cattle drive after the trail boss was the point rider. The point rider led the herd. He rode at the front, setting the pace and the direction, reading the terrain ahead, making the moment-to-moment decisions about where the cattle were going and how fast. A bad point rider could exhaust a herd, lead it into dangerous terrain, or allow it to drift off the intended route. A good point rider was the difference between a successful drive and a disaster. Black cowboys held point rider positions on drives across the era. not occasionally, regularly. In some accounts, they were considered among the best in the business by the men who worked alongside them and the trail bosses who depended on them. This was not charity. Trail bosses did not give the most important position on a drive to men they did not trust. They gave it to the men who could do the job. A trail boss in 1871 stands at the front of a newly assembled herd and looks at his crew. He needs someone he can trust at point for 1,000 miles of uncertain terrain. He picks the man he has seen do it before, the man whose judgment he trusts, the man who will make the right call when a decision needs to be made in the next 30 seconds, and there is no time to consult anyone. That man is black. The trail boss does not think about this as a social statement. He thinks about it as a practical decision. He needs the drive to succeed. He puts his best man at point. The drive succeeds. That story repeats itself in dozens of variations across the cattle drive era. It does not appear in the dime novels. It does not appear in the paintings. When the mythology of the cowboy was being constructed in the 1880s and 1890s by writers who had often never been west of Ohio, the black cowboys who had done this work were not useful to the narrative being built. The narrative required a specific kind of hero. Those writers chose their hero and built the story around him. Everyone else disappeared. Now let us talk about the specific experience of being a black cowboy in a way that goes beyond the labor statistics, because the human texture of this history is what makes it real. The open range was genuinely different from the towns. This is something that appears in enough accounts from the era to be taken seriously as a consistent feature of the experience. Out on a cattle drive, weeks from anywhere, the social hierarchies of the surrounding world did not disappear, but they were compressed by necessity. A man was judged by what he could do. A man who could not do his job was a liability. A man who could was an asset. Race did not stop mattering, but competence sometimes complicated its application in ways that it could not in the structured social environment of a town. This did not make the trail racially equal. It did not eliminate prejudice or the daily indignities that came with it, but it created a specific space where the logic of survival and shared work occasionally overrode, at least partially, the logic of the surrounding society. A white cowboy and a black cowboy are riding night herd together in Colorado in 1873. It is 2 a.m. The cattle are restless. Something is moving in the dark at the edge of the herd. Both men know what to do. Neither man needs to discuss it. They move together, quietly, handling the situation. Whatever opinion each man holds about the other in the social context of the daylight world, in this moment, they are two people doing the same thing with shared competence and shared purpose. The herd settles. They ride back to their positions. Neither man will reference this interaction in any way afterward. But it happened. It was real. That reality repeated itself thousands of times across the cattle drive era in the specific space of the work itself. And it was consistently erased when the history of the work was written, because acknowledging it would have complicated the simple racial narrative that the mythology required. But it gets worse, because the erasure was not just a matter of writers choosing to focus on white cowboys. It was active, deliberate, built into the visual culture, the publishing industry, the early film industry, and eventually the entire apparatus of popular memory. The dime novels of the 1870s and 1880s were the first major vehicle of Wild West mythology. They were cheap, widely distributed, and enormously popular. They created the template for the cowboy hero that has persisted in essentially unchanged form For over 150 years, the cowboy in those novels was almost invariably white. The non-white characters who appeared were largely villains, obstacles, or comic figures. These novels were written for a specific market. That market was predominantly white in a country that had just fought a catastrophic war over slavery and was in the process of establishing a racial hierarchy that would define American life for generations. The dime novel industry was not going to complicate that hierarchy by presenting black cowboys as heroes. It was going to reinforce it. Heroes were white. That was the product. A writer in New York in 1877 sits down to write another installment in a popular series about a frontier gunfighter. He has never been to Texas. He has never seen a cattle drive. He has read other dime novels, and he is writing more of the same. His hero is brave, skilled, and white. The supporting characters who ride with him are white. The villains are mixed, some white, some not. The world he is creating bears almost no relationship to the actual West he is supposedly describing. His books sell thousands of copies. The actual cowboys whose lives he is supposedly drawing on will never read them, and if they did, they would not recognize themselves. This process compounded with each decade. The dime novels established the template. Early theater picked it up. Wild West shows, the traveling spectacles that toured the country in the 1880s and 90s, presenting a theatrical version of frontier life, reinforced it. And then film arrived, and film calcified it permanently. The early Western films of the 1910s and 20s drew directly on the dime novel tradition. The cowboy hero was white. The landscape was dramatic. The story was simple. And these films reached an audience of millions in a way that the dime novels never had. The image they created was not just popular entertainment. It was, for most Americans, history. It felt like history. It had the weight of history, and it had almost nothing to do with the actual history. By the time the golden age of the Western film arrived in the 1940s and 50s, the erasure was so complete that most Americans had no framework even to question it. The West was white. That was simply true. Anyone who said otherwise was revising history, except that anyone who said otherwise was actually the one citing the historical record. A child in Ohio in 1952 watches a Western on television. Cowboys and cattle and open range. Every face on screen is white. The child absorbs this the way children absorb everything, as reality, as the way things were, as history. That child will carry this image for decades. It will shape what they think they know about the American West. And nobody in their school, their community, or their culture will tell them that 1 in 4 of those cowboys they are imagining as white was actually black. Nobody will tell them because nobody told the people who told them. That is how an erasure becomes permanent, not through a single decision, but through repetition, through institutional weight, through the compounding of absence across generations until the absence itself feels like truth. Now here is the question that deserves a real answer. If black cowboys were so central to the cattle industry, why were there so few who became famous? The popular history has 1 or 2 names, and even those names are barely known outside of specific historical circles. Why did not more stories survive? The answer has several layers, and each layer is uncomfortable. First, fame in the Wild West era was largely a product of journalism and publication, and journalism and publication were controlled by white men writing for white audiences. A black cowboy who did something remarkable was less likely to have it recorded and far less likely to have it circulated in ways that would allow the story to persist. The channels that created frontier celebrity were not neutral. They selected for specific kinds of stories and specific kinds of people. Second, many black men who worked on the frontier were formerly enslaved people who had very specific reasons to keep a low profile. Attracting attention could mean attracting danger. A man who had escaped slavery, or who had family still in danger, or who simply understood the risks of being conspicuous as a black man in post-Civil War America, had powerful incentives toward invisibility. Staying unremarkable was a survival strategy. Fame was not on the list of priorities. A man rides into a Kansas town in 1868. He has been on the trail 4 months. He is skilled, experienced, and known among the men he works with as one of the best they have ridden with. He collects his wages, does what he came to do, and leaves without drawing any particular attention. This is not accidental. He has learned over many years and in many places that drawing attention as a black man in a white-dominated space leads to outcomes that are rarely good. He is invisible by design. The invisibility protects him. History does not record him. That is the point. Third, the documentation of the cattle drive era was inconsistent at best. Trail bosses kept basic records. Payrolls existed sometimes, but the names of working cowboys, particularly the lower-ranked hands, were often not preserved. The drives that entered the historical record did so largely through the accounts of trail bosses and cattle owners, the men at the top of the hierarchy who were almost exclusively white. Their accounts centered themselves and the men immediately around them. The full crews, diverse as they often were, appear as background figures, if they appear at all. This is where the historical work of recovery becomes so important and so difficult. Researchers who have spent years in archives, pulling up payrolls and census records and pension applications and letters, have found black cowboys in the data with enough regularity to confirm the 25 to 30% estimate. But those names are fragments, not stories. A name on a payroll is not a life. It is proof that a life existed, which is something, but it is not the thing itself. And this is where things change, because in the last few decades, historians have begun the serious work of reconstructing what was deliberately obscured, not just finding names, but finding context, finding the communities that black cowboys came from and returned to, finding the family histories that preserved memories the official record did not, finding the specific drives, the specific ranches, the specific moments where the work of black cowboys was essential and documented. What that research reveals is not just a corrected body count. It reveals a richer, more complex, more honest picture of what the West actually was. The West was not a white space with a few non-white exceptions. It was a genuinely multiracial place where people from enormously varied backgrounds collided in the specific conditions of a frontier economy and made something that had never existed before. Mexican vaqueros who had been working cattle in the Southwest for generations before any Anglo rancher arrived. Indigenous people navigating a world being systematically taken from them while also participating in its new economies in ways that the popular history refuses to acknowledge. Chinese workers who built the railroads that transformed the West's geography. And black men and women who brought skills and knowledge and labor that were absolutely foundational to the cattle industry that everyone agrees was the defining enterprise of the era. All of these people were there. All of them shaped what the West became. And the story that was told afterward kept almost all of them out. A rancher in Texas in 1872 runs his operation with a mixed crew, Mexican vaqueros who taught half his white cowboys the roping techniques they use. Black riders who have been handling cattle on this land since before the war. White hands, some from Texas, some from further east. The operation works because all of these people's knowledge and labor combine into something that functions. The rancher knows this. He does not think about it philosophically. He thinks about it practically. The work gets done. 20 years later, when a writer comes to record the history of the great Texas ranches, the rancher tells the story of his operation. The writer records the trail boss's name, the cattle owner's name, and a general description of the drives. The vaqueros are mentioned as colorful local figures. The black riders are not mentioned at all. The white hands are named. The rancher does not correct this. The writer does not ask. That is how history is made. That is how it gets unmade. Now let us talk about what happened to black cowboys as the cattle drive era wound down, because that transition reveals something important about how race and economics intersected in the West. The great cattle drive era lasted roughly from the late 1860s to the late 1880s. The railroads, expanding their reach into Texas and the Southwest, made the long drives to Kansas increasingly unnecessary. Ranching shifted from the open range model to a fenced, more sedentary operation. The work changed, and as the work changed, the specific leverage that skilled black cowboys had in an economy desperate for their skills began to erode. The new ranching economy was more settled, more socially structured, and more aligned with the racial hierarchy of the surrounding society. Foremen on established ranches increasingly hired according to the racial preferences of the owners, which in most cases meant preferring white workers even when black workers were more skilled. The meritocracy of the trail, imperfect and incomplete as it was, gave way to the social hierarchy of the settled ranch. A black cowboy who had ridden point on 3 major drives in the 1870s finds himself increasingly unable to get the same quality of work in the 1880s. Not because he is less skilled, because the industry has changed in ways that his skill no longer overrides other considerations. He takes work where he can find it. He does not complain to anyone who could record his complaint. He works, he survives, he disappears from the record. And this is the final uncomfortable truth that this history keeps returning to. The West that the mythology celebrates, the open range, the cattle drive, the freedom of the frontier, was, for the black men who helped build it, also a place of constraint, danger, and systematic denial. The freedom was real in some moments, and in some spaces, and completely absent in others. The work was real, and it was valued, when it was valued, for purely instrumental reasons. The humanity behind the work was not. There is a specific kind of injustice in being essential to something, and erased from its history. It is not the most violent injustice in American history, but it is a persistent one. It compounds across generations. It shapes what people know about themselves and what they are allowed to claim as their own inheritance. A black child in America today who grows up with no idea that their ancestors may have been among the men who built the cattle industry, who helped define the working cowboy that the country celebrates as a national icon, that child has been robbed of something. They have been robbed of the truth. A man in a black community in Texas in 1935 tells his grandchildren about his grandfather who rode cattle drives in the 1870s. The grandchildren half listen. They have seen westerns. They know what cowboys look like. Their grandfather does not look like that. The story does not connect to anything they have been given to connect it to. It floats, unanchored, and eventually it fades. The grandfather rode point on 2 drives. He is not in any history book. His name is in a payroll record that no one has looked at in 50 years. His grandchildren's grandchildren will not know his name. That loss is the real cost of the erasure, not just the historical record, the living memory, the inheritance, the sense of belonging to a history that is actually yours. Here is what the recovery of this history makes possible, not just a corrected textbook, a corrected self-understanding. When the actual history of the West is told, when the 25 to 30% figure is not a surprise, but a known fact, when the black cowboys who rode point and managed herds and built the cattle industry are part of the basic story, the West stops being someone else's history and becomes everyone's. Because it always was everyone's. The mythology just lied about it. A researcher in a university archive in 1997 pulls a payroll document from an 1873 cattle drive, 14 names. 4 of them she can trace to formerly enslaved people from Texas. One of them appears in a later census record as a ranch foreman in Colorado. She sits with this document for a long time. She is not the first person to see it, but she may be the first person to understand what she is looking at. She starts writing. That writing eventually reaches people who were never told, people who had the history but not the story, people who now have both. That is how erased history comes back. Slowly, through people willing to look at what was always there, waiting. The black cowboys of the Wild West were there. They were essential. They were skilled. They were human beings doing difficult work in difficult conditions, with the full weight of a racist society pressing down on them from every direction except, occasionally, the specific space of the work itself. They deserve to be known. And now, finally, you know,